I think that the first point really is it kind of came with the music, but the music came first. The message came first. The religious component, or that spiritual component, was part of the package if you wanted it to be. It was optional, certainly for me. And I found that, I don't know, maybe I'm just a difficult personality, but there are aspects of that I found questionable, let's say, as an individual. But that didn't prevent me from getting into the music and the message. For other members of the group, they actually identified the spiritual element first. And in some cases that's where it kind of stayed. So it was different from one person to the next. So we took a decision. It was actually a very conscious decision. Up until the time we started to write music, we spoke about things in a third person. So we were trying to be Jamaican. And coming from Birmingham, we wanted to be the best band in the UK, but we had to compete with the likes of bloody Aswad at the time, who sounded much more authentic than we did. But also they were in London, the capital of all things music, and they had the props. They were already signed to Island Records when we were still trying to get a deal. And we made the decision that, do you know what, we'll never sound Jamaican enough that Jamaicans will say that we sound Jamaican, because Jamaicans will come up to you and just say, your accent's not Jamaican, your music's not Jamaican, right? And at one point it just sank in. It was like, you know what, they're absolutely right. And so we embraced our experience, and we embraced that in terms of how we looked, how we performed, the lyrical content. We wrote about our experiences, our lives, our community. And that's what made Still Pulse different from, say, Aswan. We embraced the local community, which was first the Jamaican community, who would literally bottle you if you didn't sound good. And then we embraced the punk community, who'd throw glass in your face if they liked you. So it's a very odd mix of kind of audiences. And we brokered reggae bands playing with punk bands the hard way, because easily at one point 50% of our gigs was a fight between the band and the audience, and the audience is fighting you because they liked you. That's how it was in the day. And then we took a stance one day on stage and we says, we will fight you. We said this on stage. You know, first thing you go on stage was stand there and go, look, if you want to fight, let's just do it now, right? And we became very militant about what we were doing. I made 7 Ku Klux Klan hoods at one point, and in this punk gig somewhere up north, we went on stage, and as I think 7 of us in the band, 7 black guys on stage wearing Ku Klux Klan hoods, and the whole audience just went dead. It's like, huh? It shouldn't be us wearing these masks. It was just a bizarre spectacle, and we then got known for being militant, and we will fight. So you don't throw booze at us, you don't throw bottles at us, and so on. And we're singing about the same stuff that, you know, punks could relate to. And we developed a relationship with them. In fact, I think we did 3 tours with the Stranglers. Very, very difficult tours or gigs on occasion, especially when we got to Glasgow. Very, very militant, or what's I say, violent gigs. But that gave us a certain status between the Midlands going north that then resonated in London. And we had a relationship with a punk community that other reggae bands didn't. I think in terms of fitting in with a rebellion, it's part of the times that created the next movement. If we hadn't brokered that relationship between punks, which were just musicians in that era, just another set of musicians, all musicians, I think, to some extent, are rebellious. The next era, which kind of chilled out, which was the early 80s, wouldn't happen in the way that it did. And if you look at what launched the early 80s, I call it blue-eyed soul and blue-eyed reggae, there's a total crossover. The bands that were performing reggae and performing ska were now suddenly all white and referred to as pop. So without the era before, the first wave of bass culture, we wouldn't have the second wave, where we see the assimilation of that whole experience. After Steel Pulse, I realized that how fragile the industry is, and that this career that I thought you have in one band is a complete bloody nonsense. The average band lasts about 6 months. If you're lucky, this is 6 months after you're recognized as being successful by the industry, by the way. That's the death of most bands. Success is the death of most bands. Let me just put that on record. And what it means is that everything you've been working for, as soon as you achieve it, you lose focus. And this happens with bands, and this happened in Steel Pulse as well. And also, that success feeds the egos, and the egos are just horrible bits of energy, really, that can be really destructive. So after Steel Pulse, I vowed never to be in another band. That was it. And I went into production and making and selling bands, and that's what I did for about 5 years. And I made bands and sold them to labels, managed, produced, and I created the first black ska band, because at the time they were all mixed, which incidentally Ridley Scott's films is making a biopic on at the moment, a band called Headline, which is Madness reference, which Selector referenced, because of the violence that was involved, again, between skinheads and ska bands. So I did that for about 5 years, and then I went strictly into producing, which was all kinds of artists. But in that period, I created something called the Reggae Philharmonic Orchestra, which was the first black orchestra in the UK. And Reggae Philharmonic Orchestra abbreviates to RPO. And with the orchestra, we did lots of productions and went in and arranged. And this included Maxi Priest's number 1, Close to You, Soul to Soul's first album, Mark Morrison, Wet Wet Wet, Bjork, Peter Andre, lots of kind of poppy stuff. And that was really successful. And then it gets boring again. And at the same time, I started to get into making documentaries, and I got Channel 4 to make a documentary of the Reggae Philharmonic Orchestra in Jamaica, and that was well. And then I got Prince's Trust to sponsor us to go to Hong Kong, and we did this whole tour of Japan and Hong Kong, which again was interesting in terms of different places embracing reggae. And around about that time I got contacted by the university, who were looking at delivering a course on commercial music, because up to that point you had courses on classical music and courses on jazz, but nothing on contemporary popular kind of music. And I was called in as a consultant because of all these weird bands that I'd worked on, and helped write the course. And then over the years I got sucked in slowly, and so this year we celebrate 20 years of the course. This is the University of Westminster. At the university I'm now head of music production, and I've, as part of kind of my experience, I've introduced bass culture as an actual course. So we're the first course to be delivering this history, this particular take on British popular music history. I'm also external examiner for Open University, so I look at courses up and down the country and slowly introducing this narrative, if you like, into these courses, which currently describe this section of popular music as dance. So, which is an all-embracing, convoluting term, much the same as urban, another nonsense term within the UK kind of vernacular. So, I mean, that's kind of what I do. It's still being rebellious, but now it's within institutions. I think part of being a successful musician is having a conversation with your audience, one which the audience recognizes and appreciates, and also a conversation with yourself which is kind of pragmatic, realistic, and honest. Those conversations need to happen in some kind of harmony. If you have no conversation with your audience, and that's the end of it, really. If you have a conversation and they don't respect you, that's kind of difficult, and it's difficult to move forward. I've learned that from writing pop songs and working with artists, that although I'm working with the artist, my conversation is with the potential audience. In academia, the audience is the students, but it's also the institution. And really, you have to understand the conversation in a way that you're able to communicate, which means compromise. It's being tenacious, but it's also researching your information. If this was production, I researched the audience, I researched the music community, I researched the music industry, so that I understand what it is I'm trying to do. I don't assume. In academia, it's much the same. So it wasn't a challenge for me. Academia hasn't accepted me because they want to accept me. They've accepted me because they have no bloody choice. Truth be known, I have no academic qualifications, if the truth be told. It doesn't. But what I have is what's called experiential learning. So it means every so often I have to fill in a form, and the first few pages I go, sorry. And we have a conversation, and they go, okay. And what that means is they understand that my cumulative experience is of value. And this really speaks to a lot of black musicians, or musicians in general. It's understanding how you translate that cumulative learning into something which academia recognizes. But that's exactly what academia is about. It's about cumulative learning, knowledge, and how you transfer that. So it's a conversation, and with all conversations, it's understanding the language. I think in terms of where we are today, it's really interesting. We've got to a point now in the UK where in education we're still battling to recognise the black music contribution to pop and popular culture, although it's glaringly obvious if you're in the UK. In terms of musicians that have been doing this for the last 30, 40 years, if you're a black musician, the chances are there's no record of what your contribution is. Your kids have no way of referencing what you did unless it ended up as a record, a piece of vinyl. The chances are that it's written up in a book are absolutely slim, and if it's not in a book, chances are of it being researched are almost nil. If it's not researched and then regurgitated as a thesis or a piece of written work, it's lost. And in the UK, there's a major contribution that I've been talking about under the heading bass culture that is in danger of being lost now. And in terms of heritage, it's absolutely critical in terms of British history, a specific contribution from a community, and the impact of this community on British society in general, where there's a risk that this history, this contribution gets lost. One, because it's mainly exists in the memories of individuals now that are in their 70s, their 80s in some cases. So the hosts of these memories are fragile. They're in reduced numbers every year. But what they have experienced is, in some respect, is what you find in museums and galleries and so forth. What we don't have is their oral testimonies, so we can't hear them speak about what it was like. What was it like for the black community in the 60s or the 70s? Who was the first black promoter in the UK? Who set up the first touring circuits? who were the first managers and what were their struggles with labels? What was the real relationship between black music in the UK and the record labels? In terms of that crossover we spoke about in the second wave, the 80s through to the 90s, what you probably wouldn't realise, the number of black managers behind some of those white bands, even Madness, Bad Manners, other bands, they had black managers to begin with that were fired when they got signed to the white labels. There's a whole story there that really speaks about the underbelly, what I call the dark side of the music industry, that is at risk of being lost. And when you say, why is this important? I now deal with students from Eastern Europe who assume that ska was invented in Leicester. When an American musician who was a member of No Doubt said that, we laughed about it and said, okay, it's America. But when someone from Eastern Europe says ska started in Leicester, and we should be grateful for skinheads, racist skinheads, because without them, there'd have been no support for Jamaican music in Britain. You start to realise there's something gone slightly wrong here. So in terms of producing that narrative, in terms of heritage content, and framing it in its relationship to what is pop, and if you understand pop and why the UK is capital for it, it's capital because pop is multiculturalism manifested as music. And we're capital in the world for multiculturalism. So let's credit all the communities that have made that creative output successful. Otherwise it's a lie. So there's a lie being perpetrated in terms of the success of pop if you don't credit the contribution from bass culture. And so those individuals that would be empowered to be more successful are not, because they can't see a legacy that is theirs. So for me, it's almost criminal not to do it. It's absolutely critical that we, as a society, a community, credit that past. And in cities like Bristol, Birmingham, London, that community is owed a debt that can only be paid through heritage.